Hi, I'm Brant at Crocker Farm, and I wanted to talk a little bit today about Alexandria, Virginia stoneware. In particular, this really interesting picture that we received for our upcoming March 3rd, 2012 auction. This picture is stamped with the maker's mark, H.C. Smith, Alexa, abbreviation of Alexandria, DC. And DC refers to the fact that Alexandria was, from the inception of the District of Columbia, part of the District of Columbia. I forget the exact date that it became part of Virginia, but it wasn't too long after this piece was made. This piece was probably made about 1845. Alexandria was an unusually prolific stoneware center for its size, I would say. Stoneware potters started earlier than this, but the first stoneware potters to make stoneware that looked something like this would have been John Swan and James Miller, Swan around the late 18-teens, and then Miller in the 1820s. This particular mark is not the mark of the potter, but is the mark of a merchant who owned the potter's shop, who owned the stoneware shop. His name was Hugh Charles Smith. He's pretty well known to collectors of Alexandria stoneware. He employed potters, obviously, to work at his shop. One of those potters was Benedict C. Milburn, who is possibly the most famous, I would say he's definitely the most famous Alexandria stoneware potter, and he would mark his wares BC Milburn Alexa usually. This picture is made under his superintendence of H.C. Smith's shop, but it's pretty clear to us that this is actually the work of a potter who has sort of slipped through the cracks of history, but was pretty influential throughout Maryland and Virginia. His name was James Shinnick. James Shinnick was born about 1814 in Baltimore, or at least in Maryland. He apprenticed with the very prolific David Parr. Sometime around the time he was 17, he started that apprenticeship. And if you're not familiar with David Parr, he was, bar none, one of the most prolific potters really in American history as far as stoneware potters go. And I would suggest you look at the video Luke recently shot of him talking about David Parr and his influence. James Shinnick probably sometime around 1840, maybe a little earlier, traveled down from Baltimore and started working in Alexandria. And he shows up in the census of 1850 working there as a potter. His designs are fairly derivative of Baltimore designs. If you notice this clover style design with these kind of like fern-shaped designs are very similar, if you're familiar with Baltimore stoneware, to the kind of things Baltimore potters started making around the late 1820s and eventually developed into a very uniform style by the later part of the century. That was kind of the Baltimore thing to do, was to decorate your pieces with what are today referred to as clovers. But that design really kind of started at the shop of Henry Remy late in the 1820s, I would say. Actually the shop of a merchant named H. Myers at which Remy was working. And that's really the earliest we've seen this design. And it kind of morphed from there into other things in Baltimore and then traveled various different places, one of which was Alexandria. And you see this very typical, what would typically be called a Baltimore design on Alexandria pieces. And when you see it, it's very distinctive. And we're pretty sure that this guy, James Shinnick, made the pieces that bear that design. One of the reasons we can say that is that Shinnick wasn't just from Baltimore, and didn't just work in Alexandria, but then went on in the 1850s to work in Strasburg, Virginia, where he seems to have worked at the shops of Jeremiah Keister and William LeHue, if you're familiar at all with the pottery of those two gentlemen, some of them bear very distinctive decorations that look a lot like Baltimore designs. From there, Shinnick went down further into the Shenandoah Valley to Rockingham County, to Mount Crawford in that county, and he partnered with two men, one named Matthias Ireland, another named George Dewey. And he was there by about 1868, and he had a couple different partnerships there. One was called Ireland and Shinnick, and the other was called Ireland, Dewey, and Shinnick. And there are pieces bearing that mark. It's quite rare, Ireland, Dewey, and Shinnick. And this is an example of a potter who ended up being very influential in his life, taking what was a design that started in Baltimore, helping to spread it down into Virginia, where it became something of a distinctive style of its own in various places. But other than those pieces marked late, relatively later in the century in Rockingham County, he didn't sign any work, and people didn't know who he was. It's fairly anonymous. But this particular piece, aside from the fact that it's interesting in that this guy, James Shinnick, probably made it, this would be considered one of the better pieces of stoneware that the Alexandria potters had to offer from that time. It's just a rare form with profuse decoration, a really nice size, really interesting shape, kind of a tall shape instead of the more bulbous shape you sometimes see. We were very excited to get this for our auction. And this is also a previously undocumented example that recently came out of a DC area state. So we're very happy to be able to offer this to the public.